Welcome to OzCast, the platform where we take a deep dive into the science and research behind the issues impacting Australian waterways. Each week, we team up with experts in their field to take a look below the surface. Gary, we're back. We've had a drink, a break, time to think about what we haven't covered. And one of the things I want to dive into straight away, and you mentioned it just before we took a quick break there. On the international stage, you were talking about this idea of carbon burial or carbon acquisition, and we touched on it very briefly. But that's one of the things that I've seen surface a lot in mainstream media, particularly in the last 3 years. Well, since I've been involved in this world, in this industry, is the value of seagrass, not just for our fish, which is what I'm really concerned about, but for global warming, for, I guess, humans generally. I think the statistic is, and you're going to clarify this for me, but they're more productive or more advantageous than a tropical rainforest. And that's something that, blows my mind and it will blow many people's mind listening. So let's touch on that. What role do they have in storing carbon and why is that so important?
Okay, so this is really interesting for me because this puts a value per hectare on seagrasses in relation to carbon burial. But it's very important to realise that seagrasses perform a whole pile of ecological functions, and carbon burial is just one of them. Now, in terms of carbon burial, I've talked a little bit about, I mentioned Peter McCready, and I talked a little bit about Shark Bay and how over the millennia we've got 8 metres of sediment developed. That is full of carbon, up to 7% in some instances in the course we've got. So it's loaded in terms of organic carbon and organic carbon burial. And so when we talk about seagrasses being having more carbon per hectare than a tropical rainforest, we're not talking about the above ground, the living material. We're just talking about the accretion rate and the burial of carbon in seagrass meadows versus not in seagrass meadows, like out in normal sandy environments. It's really interesting to me, and I've been a bit of a naysayer with this. The value varies, but it's about $60 to $80 for a valued hectare of seagrasses in terms of carbon accumulation in the top metre.
Right.
So, really, that's not a lot of money.
Not a lot of money, no.
No, but it's off value because there are many industries out there that are looking for local ways to invest what they call is their green environmental budgets into something that they can trade. So out of the, maybe we could even sell it for $100 but it's about that figure. Can we do credits? Can we do thousands of seagrass meadows or thousands of mangrove swamps, thousands of hectares of them? The problem for me is that that's value for existing meadows. When you do restoration, you don't have a carbon accumulation for up to 5 to 8 years.
And once it's established.
Once you've got it on the ground, it takes, in the establishment phase, there is no signature for a large carbon accumulation. It takes a decade for you to start to accumulate the sort of carbon that's being accumulated in a mature meadow. And you've got to put that into your equation. So you're not going to see a profit for 8 to 10 years. And I find the people get excited about these new markets. I would like to put forward that the value of seagrasses are in the tens to 30s of thousands of dollars for all the other ecosystem functions they perform in a coastal environment, as well as carbon. So, sorry. So I think it's important that we don't just look at carbon. I think it's important we include carbon because it's a way that developing countries can market their coastal resources for conservation. So the value of putting a dollar value on it is for the conservation of that environment. If we're really serious about conservation, I think we should be looking at voluntary crediting of biodiversity and Australia would win out because our biodiversity is so high in seagrass meadows, reefs, etc. And if you think about it, at the moment we are not investing enough money in looking after those conserved areas that we have already in national parks and marine parks, etc. So trading the biodiversity for cash, or trading on that biodiversity will remain, that's actually what you're trading. The carbon will remain for a century, or the biodiversity will remain for a century. You can then use the income, the annual income, to actually invest in making sure that biodiversity remains.
Is the idea of carbon burial, the idea it gets stored in their leaves, in their roots, below the surface? What's the process?
The process is, it's the sediment under the seagrass. Seagrass itself turns over a lot, and it's how much seagrass ends up in the sediment that is broken down over time. The reason it remains in the sediment, why it's so high in the sediment, is most marine sediments are anoxic, or they don't contain any oxygen with depth in the sediment. So you don't get the normal oxygenetic breakdown of organic matter that you'd get in, say, a banana peel you throw on the ground, for instance.
Yeah. So when we hear of this value that seagrass has for carbon, it's the burying of that particular matter that anything that gets turned over and finds itself underneath the sediment is where that is what we're referring to.
So the living carbon is quite low in comparison to tropical forests' living carbon, but the actual soil buried carbon is quite high. Similarly in mangroves. It's although in mangroves there's more living carbon, of course, because mangroves are trees.
Yeah.
But mangroves are amazing how much they can bury and accumulate sediments. Similarly, salt marshes. In Australia we have a large amount of salt marshes, but they're really worth protecting. So don't build houses on them.
Yeah. I interviewed Troy Gaston, which is one of our experts on salt marsh, and he was explaining this idea that salt marshes, if you build a road behind one, well, it can't jump the road and like a fire can and continue going. That's it. You've just put a perimeter or a barrier on where the life of that seagrass is going. Sorry, that salt marsh is going to end.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, and I guess it brings me to this point. What role does relationship or role does seagrass have with other habitats? Is there one that it particularly relies on, or is it, I think mangroves and salt marsh, they intertwine quite nicely. Seagrass, seaweed, not so much. Obviously, I think.
No, very, very,
very
important.
much. So that people actually, particularly me, I only learnt this from reading some of your papers recently. They're different things. A seagrass is not a seaweed. It sounds obvious to someone like yourself, but to the naked eye, they're the same thing.
That's like saying a fungus is the same as a plant.
Yeah, right. So they're incredibly different, but they have a strong relationship in how they interact.
I always think when people talk the ecosystem, they talk, the seagrass ecosystem, the kelp ecosystem. I don't think they're separate. I think it's the coastal ecosystem.
Sure.
And I find it really intriguing that when I get onto, say, the Facebook page for the Great Southern Reef, which is a construct that we're creating for all of temperate reefs of Australia, that many of the videos and many of the images are seagrass meadows. And that's because we don't actually really think they're different, that they actually are part of that reefal system. Similarly, in the coral reef systems, a lot of the productivity is in the seagrass meadows and the mangrove swamps behind the fringing reef. And they are interconnected. The movement of nutrients, for instance, in Ningaloo Reef, from your seaweed meadows and your seagrass meadows into the coral reef ecosystem is quite high. And I think it's thinking about things being interconnected as humanity is interconnected, especially now with modern technology, is the way we should be looking at these systems.
What other benefits does seagrass have to our marine ecosystem, to us, to our fish? Obviously, there's a lot of them. this is the one area. You know, we've spoken so much about restoration, spoken so much about the effort put into restoring them. The only reason we're doing that is because they're incredibly important, but we haven't touched on yet what that importance actually is. So, you know, there is more than half dozen of reasons that we can cover. Let's just start at one and we'll get to the others. But, you know, the most recent one that I've learned of is the role they have in affecting wave and currents and tides, and I guess the movement of water and dampening the effects of that on our coastal, I guess, shorelines and the effect that has with erosion. Something that I didn't think was possible. I didn't know seagrass and shellfish does the same thing, could affect waves. That's, awesome.
It is, isn't it? And we've done a little bit of work on this. It's both, they can dampen waves, but it takes sort of like a metre or two into the seagrass meadow. So having patches of seagrass breaks up the waves a little bit, but when you've got a meadow, you've really got some level of dampening. And there was a recent report written for the engineering group in Australia. I can't remember what they're called, the group of engineers that I was involved in, where we looked at green engineering solutions, and seagrass sit up quite high, as do reefs, as alternatives to building breakwaters and solid structures, to actually use these structures to break up a lot of the wave energy before it gets to the beach. And to give you an idea, seagrasses in Australia are quite unique in that they occur across a very large range in swell conditions. So on the south coast of West Australia, we have a group of Posidonia species, or Poseidon's ribbon weeds, that occur in wave-swept environments. And what they do is they anchor down, they grow vertically, not horizontally, like we think of grass on the lawn or most seagrasses, like the picture behind you, they're growing horizontally. They grow vertically and they attach, and they create the environment where all the horizontal growing species then grow into. These species occur from about 5 metres down to about 40 metres in wave-swept environments. They prefer those environments to calm and sheltered ones. So these things have evolved over the last 80 million years to live in environments like the coastal Australia produces.
When the wave hits it, is it just like acting as a cushion?
Well, there's a word called monami. Have you heard of this?
No.
It's the flapping of the seagrass leaves. It was named by a Japanese person, of course.
Right.
And so when especially the ones on the board there, when they roll over, they flap at the tips and generate, they lose energy across the top of it by creating turbulence. And it's called monami. They just flap backwards and forwards. That's one way they do it. They form a dense, impenetrable substrate that when the wave gets caught in it, it drops a lot of energy in forming, loss of energy through.
Yeah, I can imagine a wave coming in on a flat surface, like a hard bench or something like that, and then, straight through. But when you start to add, where it be some type of, basically any friction to that, I assume it works in the same manner.
Yeah.
What about for our marine species? Obviously, the benefits. You said you go snorkeling in a meadow and you get lost in it. Well, there must be a reason you get lost in it, because of the amount of life that's in there. So, what's a seagrass meadow generally across a range of different species offering on that front?
Well, I think it's interesting because seagrass meadows are places you go and sit, whereas reefs are places you swim long distances on. When I go to my kelp reefs, for instance, I have a tendency to look for the unusual, but it's usually quite large. So if you're looking for the unusual, say a pineapple fish that glows underneath its eyes at night time with bacteria under them, that pineapple fish is really rare. I go look for it. Whereas when I go to seagrass meadows, I just sit and wait. And it's when you sit and wait that you see things, and they're smaller. Generally, the crustaceans and the snails, etc., are smaller in seagrass meadow than they are in reef. And it's that sitting and waiting, it's that sort of meditation that you get into. Well, why are the things smaller, and what do they feed? Well, they feed juveniles, and they feed specific types of fish. So both omnivorous and carnivorous fish, so ones that eat plants and animal material and ones that just eat animals. And that's why I think they're actually part of the reef system. Like when you think of a reef, it's the where they join is where all the activity happens with fish, for instance. Where you see large amounts of fish grazing is usually a halo around a reef. When you think about the nutrients entering that carbon accumulation under the seagrass, some of the material is coming off the reef. And there's a very well-cited paper that was written about 2006, 2008 by Thomas Wernberg and Matt Vandercliff. Matt works for CSIRO and Thomas is, a famous reef researcher. And what they talked about was how much subsidy in carbon occurs in a seagrass meadow from the reef. And it was a large amount. It was like 20%. And it's mostly the big macroalgae that get swept into a seagrass meadow from the reef when they get ripped off the reef. Now that, you say, oh, well, it's a big deal. That's just being settled down. It breaks down and feeds the seagrass meadow. Well, interesting thing, and a real interesting thing is how many invertebrates live in these rolling masses of drifting algae. And they really are a home to a lot of food resource. Thus, they're a target for fish.
Has any research been done on like what lives in a square metre or a square hectare? Obviously the people aren't in the industry love to have these beautiful rounded off figures to say, oh, X amount live in, so much. But surely, I can only assume that someone out there has tried to quantify that.
Yes, they have. And they quantified it for individual locations.
Sure.
So there's been a recent work looking at the cost benefits of seagrass meadows in Victoria and New South Wales. I think New South Wales done a bit of this. And in Victoria, the number in their estuaries is around $36,000 per hectare, which is much bigger than the carbon burial, of course. And that's just fisheries value. That's not biodiversity and it's not other values. It's around the actual value you can give for fisheries. So if you put the fisheries value and the blue carbon value and the beach protection value, I don't know how you'd calculate that, but you'd probably calculate that by how much money you spend, resanding your beaches, for instance.
Yep.
Just divide it by the difference between a seagrass fringed and a non-seagrass fringed beach. I think you're looking at tens of thousands of at least for the average seagrass.
Yep.
Now, what you've asked me is actually quite a hard thing to figure out because seagrasses aren't seagrasses. What do I mean by that? Seagrasses aren't seagrasses. Seagrasses are a diversity of forms and shapes and evolutionary processes. We think there's been 3 separate invasions of the sea, not one. So this is this is a really interesting group of evolving plants. And don't fall asleep.
Well, it's a topic that I think only someone like yourself could grapple with. What do you mean an invasion of the sea?
Well, they re-invaded or moved back into the sea. I like saying invasion because it's much more effective. They went back into the sea and they evolved from terrestrial plants into the sea.
On 3 occasions? On
3 occasions, at least. So seagrass isn't a seagrass. So if I compare a tropical, a tropical Zostera / Halophila / Haliduli meadow that, say, somebody from James Cook University would study on the Great Barrier Reef, or better still, Gulf of Carpentaria, the actual value is related to the fishery there, which of course is prawns. And they've done a lot of work, especially CSIRO, on this. And yes, without that habitat, you wouldn't have the life history closure of the prawns, you wouldn't have the juvenile prawn abundances, and you wouldn't have the prawn fishery.
What about water filtration? Does it have any role to do in that?
Yes.
And I guess how does that actually work? Because we know the value of something like an oyster or any other shellfish, but I think seagrass has a pretty important role to play in that, but it's not advertised as much. Advertised.
Again, I'd say it's the community that lives in the seagrasses. So we have recently seen papers published on human health and seagrasses. Cholera outbreaks in India have been are found to be greater where there's no seagrass and where there's seagrass. And they've been able to track the value of seagrass trapping viruses and bacteria as the water brings them through. And when you say seagrasses are trapping them, it's actually the thin layer of what I'd call filter feeders that grow on the seagrass leaf. And it's also the stickiness of the seagrass leaf in the water column. So that might be bacteria as well. So yes, there's quite a few publications just recently that have been pointing to human health being better when you have a healthy seagrass ecosystem on the beach.
Right. So all the effort that goes into restoring them is because of water filtration, the impact that it can have with, I guess, wave movement and erosion, particularly in and around the places that our coastal, where we live, basically, any of our coastal towns and cities, the habitat and food that it supplies for fish and crustaceans and prawns. And is there anything else, I guess, that we need to add to that list, or are they the big ticket items?
Oh, I think we can add a few more, but I think you're talking about the big ticket items most people think about.
So what about the ones that we perhaps don't think about?
Well, people don't put an intrinsic value on seagrasses. They put an intrinsic value on the communities of organisms that live in seagrasses, or the value of the decomposition that occurs underneath the sediment, or the lack thereof. But one of the cutest stories was a friend of mine down in Albany was requested to go and find stinky, decaying leaves of Posidonia sinuosa, which is a very common seagrass on the West Australian coastline. And he went off and got, what was it, something like 200 kilos of this thing, gave it to a perfumery, and they reckon it's better than ambergris for holding the smell. They basically boil it up and distill it, and they use it as a base for perfumes. And so there you go. There's a value there. The first explorations of Antarctica, the people didn't wear down jackets. They wore seagrass-lined jackets because of the insulation value. Old buildings in South Australia still contain seagrass as an insulator at the government buildings. So there you go. The seagrass itself, we use it in gardening, not as a nutrient, like not sea salt. It doesn't give you nutrients, but it creates aeration in very compact soils. So yes, there's plenty of uses for it. Just we haven't really done them.
Interestingly, that at the outset of the podcast, I mentioned, that I didn't think that humans either consumed or harvested seagrass for certain activities, but clearly I'm wrong. We've used it in buildings, and we use it in gardening, and we use it in insulation, and that's another gem. You know how I said you had a gem before? There's another one. That little bits of information like that I think just never surfaces, which is really interesting. What about knowledge gaps? You obviously know a lot. There's a lot of your colleagues that know a lot. But there's a lot you don't know, and I love it when people can admit something that we just don't know yet. Is there one that comes to mind, or is there a focus area that you would love to see in the next 10 or 5 years? Some real time and energy put into understanding that. Is there something that keeps you up at night that frustrates you as like, what is the answer? You know what I mean? Surely there's something that's occurred over your career that is still, I guess, undecided.
Well, you've hit on a really big one here. I think knowledge, the way we do science, is to create the question, not create the answer. So the technology plus science gives us the answer. The science creates a body of questions. And that's my personal view. The interesting thing about that body of questions that's really hit me just recently is here we've been spending a lot of time looking at genetic diversity and clonal size and reproduction, and then we hit on this 180 kilometre single tetraploid clone. And what does that mean? What does that mean for all the research I've done in the past? And what it means is that there's a whole area that we haven't looked at in seagrasses that needs to be investigated pretty quickly if we're at all interested in climate change and major loss. And that is, what is the role of ploidy levels, like increasing it from our diploid state to tetraploidy, what is that role and how important is that in the maintenance and persistence of seagrasses as we restore them? So are we really looking at a system that has a whole pile of adaptability in it to change that we can utilise for restoration to get the best outcome? Rather than creating the perfect seagrass, maybe we're looking at it right now. And to me, that requires, I'm going to use some words here, I do apologise, that's going to require a whole suite of omics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, all of the omics words, and looking at microbial plant interactions to understand what it is and how that allows these seagrasses to persist across so many environments. We have Posidonias occurring here and in the Mediterranean. We have Zostras occurring across the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. Zostra marina occurs across the whole of North America. So is it showing an amazing amount of phenotypic plasticity? Sorry, that's a science word. Or plasticity in the way it expresses its growth and its shape? Or is there some adaptive process going on here that we can utilise to maintain and grow hot water surviving seagrasses?
Have you ever thought about, or has the conversation ever come up about artificial seagrass?
Oh, we've done that.
Can you manufacture seagrass?
Yeah, it's all out of plastic and it's a waste of time.
Right.
Now,
I know there's conversations around you can manufacture a salt marsh or a riparian zone, and Matt Landos in episode 1 of this series explained the role that the artificial salt marsh could have in trapping contaminants and nutrients, and I saw value in that, and so does he. Obviously that's out of the water. These zones are intertidal. Seagrass, I think, is a bit different.
Yeah, well, we've used artificial seagrass to, make a substrate to grow things on, to understand the problems that occur in the environment that we can manage. I like covering with algae, and we've used it in restoration, so we've already tried it. It's a very good early adopter. So if you put it in before you start planting, you can actually break up the hydrodynamics. You can break up the swells. And there's been some investigation of carbon, just pure organic carbon structures, and they do work, especially in wave-swept environments. But they're very expensive if you're talking hectares, and you've got to take them out. So in other words, unless they break down naturally, you're putting more plastic in the ocean, and we've got enough in plastic in the ocean already.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. And I've done some of this, and I've always gone, can't we make it out of something that would just break down?
Yeah, right, not plastic.
But, that whole business about what a seagrass leaf does when it goes over and it flaps, that's why you use the plastic, because no other substrate other than...
Is going to do that.
Yeah.
You've admitted, I guess offline, you've admitted, and it's something to be very proud of. You're going to hang up the metaphorical shoes soon, and go into what you would just call, not retirement, because you're not leaving the industry, but I guess you're leaving the research world in a job title sense. You'll still be around doing a lot of things in the industry. When you do that, what's something that Gary wants to be remembered for? What's a contribution that you've made to seagrass restoration that you could sit there and go, yep, I had a bloody good role to play in that, and don't be modest, because I think we get people like this, like yourself, on this platform to hear of those fist pump moments where you go, I did that, and we've heard plenty in this series before with Martin Malin Cooper in the lab and talking about fist passage, and Matt Landos talking about, discovery of different diseases that have come in and tracing them back to wastewater outlets. So what's your legacy going to be?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm going to answer the question and I'm going to give you a caveat.
Great. We love caveats.
The reason I'm going to give you the caveat is I think there is a change afoot. I would like to be remembered for seed-based restoration approaches for things in Australia. And that's where I'm spending most of my effort, is in the seed-based space. And I'd like to be known for a successful 100-hectare transplantation trial in Shark Bay for 3 years after I've finished this job. We've got the funding. We're going to go trial it. We've set a goal that is a bit like 1 million seeds. We thought was impossible. It's 100 hectares of sprigs planted. And that's that whole program around tidal moon and the Aboriginal, community up in Shark Bay. I would love to be known as the person behind the technology that made that happen at scale, and prove that seagrass restoration isn't something that a bunch of scientists do in their spare time. It's something that we can build industry around. I would also like to be known for exploring biodiversity crediting in a serious way with a bunch of economists and lawyers, which is what I'm doing right now.
And the caveat?
The caveat is I want you guys to go out there and take ownership of everything I've done. And to do that, you don't need to give me acknowledgements, because it takes away from what everybody is doing personally to make it happen. We are not individuals that need pats on the back. We are community, and we're a community of diverse individuals that are talking together about a common outcome. And that's, to me, more important than personal accolades.
It's a good caveat. It's a very good one. So your message is don't try credit me. Take what I've done and run with it further for the next generation. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Don't let it stop with you.
I don't want you to remember my name in 15 years.
Yeah, because someone else should have picked that up.
I want you to own what I'm doing right now.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think, hopefully what we're doing here with seeds and what you're doing in Shark Bay, hopefully, that happens. I
didn't mention Seeds for Snapper because I'm going to be around.
You're not going anywhere.
I'm not going anywhere. And
you're part of the furniture.
My goal is to stop the naysayers. My goal is to cut but you haven't proven this. I am so over that. Let's get out there, let's do it, and let's look at the outcomes in 5 to 10 years.
What does 5 to 10 years look like for you, from Gary's perspective? Where do you want to be? Where should we be at?
I want us to have 100 hectares out there.
100 hectares.
Of grown from seeds. 100 hectares, bugger it. Sorry, I don't mean to swear, but...
Yeah, from the community too.
That's the community job. That's OzFish. That's owned. A lot of times I get the words from the team, OzFish is taking all the credit and all this sort of stuff. And I'm going, no, they're not. They're doing all the work. We have given the technology to a group of people that are out there doing it right now, and we're going to assist them in any way we can until this becomes the OzFish owned, loved, funded program.
Well, OzFish is owned by its chapters, which are volunteers. So, there's no
That's exactly it. It's volunteers.
It's volunteers. There's no.
You've answered.
The ownership comes from whoever wants to own that project, which is what the OzFish model is. You start a chapter, you develop your program.
Exactly.
Our scientists and team help you do that, but it's really your program, which is so cool with Seeds for Snapper. So I like to kind of give every guest, as we round out, a kind of a chance to a final message, a final word of encouragement to anyone listening. But it's been a great chat. We've touched on the importance of seagrass, not only for humans and blue carbon burial, but for the fish species. We've touched on what's happened to that seagrass over the last, since 1981 or 82. The issues that's faced with light, dredging, coastal urbanisation, through to the differences between the West Coast and the East Coast and how it can grow a little bit further out. Looked at a bunch of restoration methods, which was extremely interesting, from Seeds for Snapper through to what you're doing in Shark Bay and the recent discovery in Shark Bay, which was excellent, through to the ones that didn't work, the trials that are still considered trials because they never got off the ground on an industrial level. And then it's great to see all that put together, puts Australia pretty high up on the world stage. We're not quite there with America, but we're not really there with America on anything except the Matildas and maybe our cricket team.
Can I just stop you there and say, we in Australia, 25 million people, plus or minus, it doesn't matter, 25 million people. That is the catchment area, the greater Los Angeles Basin catchment area, right? We're not talking about competing per capita at the scale of the USA, but if you think of it as per volunteer, we are actually hitting well above our average.
And that's awesome. Like that's a fist pump moment.
Yeah.
So to round it out, Gary, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on OzCast. There is so many little gems in there, and I hope anyone really interested in this topic will be able to go back and re-listen to this 5 or 6 times over the course of the next, few months to really kind of dig them out. There's no way you can consume all that in one go. But is there anything you'd like to leave us on? Is there a message you want to send? Is there a final point or anything to do with seagrass that you want to finish on, or are you happy to leave it there?
I think there's just one, sorry, I can't stop. There's one little thing, and that is if you feel trapped in the world of the world of things are going down the gurgler, stop. Find a program like OzFish in your area and join. Even if you're not a fisher, just get out there and get active, change the world person by person, volunteer by volunteer, and you will get so much personal satisfaction out of that. Even a scientist gets personal satisfaction out of it. That you'll become effective.
I'm going to leave it at that. I can't add any further. Thanks for your time today, mate.
Yeah, no worries.
This episode of OzCast is proudly supported by Wreckfish West, Water Corporation, Synergy, the Coburn Sounds Powerboats Club, the University of Western Australia, and BCF, Boating, Camping, Fishing.